Good evening, everyone. My name's Arnie Eby. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Resource Parent Association, and it's my honor tonight to welcome you to this training on birth family connections. This meeting will be recorded, and if you want training credit, please enter your name and jurisdiction in the chat. There are 40-some people on the call right now, and we had close to 90 people registered. So that's wonderful. It validates the fact that this is a subject that we need to talk about and we want to talk about. So thank you all for joining. Like I said, this meeting will be recorded and the recording will be available on our website in a few days. The slides will also be available for you, and if you want to watch it again, or if you know somebody who would like to watch it, please feel free to tell them about it. Tonight, I'm joined by Kim Stevens from NACAC. NACAC is the North American Council on Adoptable Children. She is a program manager there, but most of all, she's an adopted mom of 4 children from the public foster care system. So she knows and understands the world we live. I will allow her to tell you all about the other wonderful things and awards that she's won, because she'll do a far better job than I. I'll also be transferring the host of the meeting over to her so she can share her slides. So thank you all for joining, and we're going to jump right into it. Welcome, Kim. And it's your show.
Thanks so much, Arnie. I just have to take note of the fact that my sister of the heart and my colleague, Phyllis Stevens, and I did some work with the Maryland Resource Parent Association several years ago when Arnie was first becoming president. And at that time, he and the organization were talking a lot with us about how to build up the organization, keep it sustainable, keep it growing. And I'm going to say, from the looks of things, you have done an incredible job, Arnie. What a turnout. My gosh. I'd say that's not just about the topic, but also about the great job that the organization has done to keep people engaged. So good for you. Good for you. So welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to be here with you tonight. I'll tell you, I've been on my computer doing Zoom training all day long today, from 9 o'clock this morning until 4:30 in the afternoon. And then I had another hour and a half webinar that I was a participant in. So it's a testament to how important this work is and how much I care about your organization and you all doing this work. So as Arnie said, yes, I am an adoptive mom. My husband and I have 2 birth children, and we adopted 4 children from the Massachusetts child welfare system. We adopted a 15-year-old, and then we adopted siblings who were 6 and 7, and then a little boy who was about 2.5 when he joined us. The youngest of those kids is now 34, and the oldest is 47. And I'm going to tell you right now, they're way older than I am. I want to encourage you as well to check out our website at North American Council on Adoptable Children. You'll find our website at NACAC.org. And my gosh, do we have a lot of resources there for you. If you look in the menu and you go to parenting, you will just find a ton of resources. I'm also going to send Arnie an email after the fact to give you all some additional resources that you can look at to support your work with supporting your kids' connections to their birth families. But I'll tell you what we've learned over the years is that being able to support our kids and being connected to the families and the communities that they come from is absolutely so essential to their well-being, so essential to their being able to understand their identity, their journey, both where they've come from and where they're going. So I'm excited and really, really grateful that you're here with me tonight. I'm guessing like me, all of you are tired too. You've had long days. You're probably still doing schooling on a computer with your kids at the same time as you're trying to work remotely. So thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you being here. I'm going to try to keep track of the chat box. But as Arnie said, he will be keeping track. I'm happy to have you interrupt me at any point in time and either clarify a point or, have a discussion about something. You don't have to wait till the end. And then, of course, in 2 weeks, we'll have a chance to get back together again and talk some more. So with that, I'm going to jump into it. And for me, I always feel like, I may have something to contribute to a conversation, but I think the people that are really living the experience have the most to say about it. And for me, these two quotes kind of say it all. And as I've gone through my own journey, I can tell you that they really ring true. This young girl, Christine, at 17, told me I needed to know where I came from. I was tired of being different. I've been different all my life. And a birth mother told me, I love them and I always wanted them to find me. So we know that these are really deep feelings that both our children and the families that they come from are really thinking about. The other thing that I have to say, this presentation, I've been doing a presentation on openness and adoption. I would say, oh geez, so our first adoption was in 1988. So what is that, 10, 20, 32 years? Is that, yeah, oh my God, my kid must be old because I'm not. But I've been doing this presentation for about 30 years now. Things have changed, right? We used to talk about how you could keep connections, some various strategies and ways, but I'm going to tell you all without a doubt that now that our kids have access to and probably a deeper understanding than we do of social media, that there's no way in the world you are going to have a closed adoption. There is not going to be a completely confidential placement. There is not going to be a completely confidential foster placement or kinship placement. All of us know that our kids and or their families can connect with each other. And so it's really a choice for us to do what we can to support our kids as they are making these really important connections. We can play a proactive role and be partners in that. And I'm going to tell you that my experience is that by becoming partners, we're going to have a better outcome for our children. We can have a passive role, but really what that passive role is going to indicate to our kids is that they're on their own and that no one is there to help them with their connections. Or in the worst of circumstances, we could really play a harmful role. And by that, I mean when we put our children in a position where they feel as though they have to choose one or the other, it very often ends up quite badly for our children, for our relationship, and for the future, really, for them. So just thinking about some of the goals. So what do we want to accomplish by having open lines of communication? Well, first of all, we know that every child who comes into care, who experiences foster care, who experiences kinship care, or who experiences adoption, regardless of how they got there. And I mean, even if a child is born into a agreed upon open adoption, even if you as the parent have been alongside the birth mom for the whole journey, you're part of the birth experience, regardless of how it happens, your child has lost. They have lost a relationship. Adoption and foster care and kinship care is something that, without exception, only happens when a child has lost a relationship. And even if that relationship has happened before they can understand it or talk about it or remember it, it doesn't minimize the fact that that loss has happened. But by having open communications, that gives our children an opportunity to be able to understand better, to be able to work through their losses, to understand their losses with reality, with truth, with honesty. Because without that, they're left to really create their own version, their own understanding of what might have happened. And oftentimes, the fantasies or the false understandings that they have can contribute to a breakdown in communication between our kids and us as their caregivers. And then the other really important piece is that we want to maintain, we want to celebrate our children's connections with all of the important people in his or her life. And if you think about it, just in terms of your own relationships with people, the more people that any one of us has in our life that cares about us, that has a connection to us, that holds a piece of the story about who we are and where we've come from, that can only serve to really help our children build a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of worthwhile, of value, right? That sense that I matter to people and people matter to me. And isn't that really the goal of what we do as caregiving anyway, is to help our children understand that they are connected to other people and to the world, and to value those connections and really create the person that they want to be. What are some of the factors that can contribute to these open communications? Certainly, one of the biggest factors is both our concern for our child as well as their birth parents' concern for their child, for their well-being, for their success, for their happiness, and for their sense of just being okay with who they are and okay in the world. That emergence of a friendship or a relationship, a collaboration between birth parents and caregivers of children, oh my gosh, that can serve in so many wonderful ways. Oftentimes, we'll see that when a child is reunified, if there has been that strong communication, that strong relationship, that when a birth parent might be struggling a little bit down the road, that a former caregiver can step in as a support. They can step in to offer respite. When the child goes on for permanency through adoption, they still get to have both families. It's not like they have to choose one or the other. And that sense of knowing the history and being able to share traditions and share stories of who we are and where we've come from is so important for our children. And then, as well as kids are growing up, as they are going through their own journey, that flow of communication between caregivers and birth families really supports children. I can remember for my son and daughter, Justice and Tanya, when they first were able to meet their birth mom, what an incredible thing it was to have birth mom be able to say to them, look, you've got two moms now. You may have an adoptive mom, but I'm your mom too. And the two of us care about you together. What a message that is for our children to have, right? Whoops, I'm sorry, I went too far. We also want to think, what are some of the factors that decrease our ability to have those open communications? And by knowing about those factors, it's going to give us an opportunity to be able to address that decreased communication. That's going to give us an ability to either think in advance about how not to let those factors get in the way, or when we see those factors getting in the way, be able to strategize in partnership with how we can deal with that. So geographic distance at one point in time seemed like a big deal, right? If nothing else, I think the last year, with having to adjust to this pandemic and having to adjust with social distancing, has shown us that we're really as connected as an internet platform, right? You all are in Maryland. I'm sitting here in Vermont, but here we are together as one. And when we stop sharing screens with the PowerPoint, we'll be able to see one another's faces. We'll still be able to have that that sort of body language, that facial communication, that nonverbal communication, because we'll be able to see one another. A bigger, much bigger factor in decreasing that open communication is certainly when we have differences in values or in life circumstances. But often, what has to do with that is a sense of judgment, whether it's on our part as caregivers or whether it's on the part of the child's family. We really are in a position where we can check ourselves. We can make sure that we're paying attention to biases or judgments or assumptions and try to address those head on, or try at least internally to have that inner dialogue about, really, is that difference enough to sacrifice our children's ability to stay connected? Or is this something that we can talk through and come to some kind of a resolution about? Many times we're going to be hearing from our relatives, from our extended family, or from friends that just don't really understand what our family makeup is like, what our values are, and also the importance of these connections for our children. They're often going to discourage us from this contact. I'm going to say that most often when that discouragement comes, it comes because these people care about us, and they may have heard us talking about, after my kiddo sees birth mom, we have so many behaviors we have to deal with. Or, trying to stick with that visitation can be really disruptive. It can be tough. We've got so much to balance. And so many times that discouragement that's coming from our friends or from our extended family really is prompted by our own words, our own actions, our own communications with them, talking about how difficult it may be to maintain that connection. And so we want to think about how we talk about it in such ways that we can discourage people from discouraging us. We really don't need one more layer, right? We've got so much else we're dealing with. Sometimes it can be that we haven't been able to come up with an agreement about what that contact looks like. And very often when that happens, it can be because we thought we had an agreement and then maybe circumstances have changed. When I look behind when circumstances have changed for my own kids with their ongoing contact, more often than not, it might have to do with a change in circumstances for their family. Maybe the family is embarrassed about something that has happened. Maybe they're struggling with something. And so our capacity as caregivers of the child, in the moment, to be able to reach out to their family and to be able to offer understanding and support can often help us to get through those difficult negotiations or those lapses in the connection. When the agency is involved, that often can get in the way. And I can tell you, I remember one of the children that we had as a foster child. We had this little guy for several years. He was in our family for almost 3 years. And I had on a number of occasions talked to the worker about connecting with his birth mom. When he was placed with us quite early on, his plan changed from reunification to adoption. And it ended up in the long run that it reverted back to reunification, and he ended up going back home to birth family. And I have to say, I still hold some anger and resentment on his behalf, because the agency and the workers, for whatever reason, were either not in a position, not willing, or not able to facilitate connection between birth mom and myself as the foster mom. And I think it really impacted her when he was coming back home. It certainly impacted him, and it impacted our family in negative ways. Had we been able to keep connection open between our two families, I think the outcome would have been a lot smoother for everybody. And so I'm going to encourage you, if you are doing foster caregiving, to really talk with your worker about how they can facilitate that connection and communication. Sometimes our own concerns for the child, again, if they come back and they're all riled up, or if they come back and they share stories with us that make us wonder if they're going to be safe, depending on the circumstances behind why they came into care in the first place, we often can feel quite protective, and we're going to want to try to shield our child that we're caring for, our child that we're also loving, from being hurt by those connections. So we really need to talk about how do we work through those fears. And then finally, when there are changes in the birth family, especially changes that are a negative impact, it can get in the way of the communication and that connection. So what about the kids, though? And for me, I always come back to, what about the children? How are the children doing? What do they need? What is behind those needs, right? So first of all, of course, they have a natural curiosity. They want to know where they came from. They want to know who their people are. If they were older when they came into care, they very often are quite concerned about the safety and well-being of their family, of their extended family, sometimes even of people, of friends, of community members, just wanting to know where are they and how are they doing. In terms of their own identity development, it's so important for children to know who they are and where they came from. What are some traits that they might hold in common with their family members? Who could they have been had things not been interrupted? Certainly, our kids are asking themselves, if they're not able to express it outright, they are asking themselves, am I a person of value? Because if I came into care, or if I were relinquished for adoption, does that mean that I'm not an okay person? Does that mean that my mom or my dad were not okay people? Does that mean that there weren't other people in my family, grandparents or aunties or uncles, who didn't care enough about me to care for me when my mom or dad couldn't? And as my own children have been able to express different curiosities, different concerns, different fears, many of those questions have come up over the years. And then finally, am I to repeat the patterns that brought me into care in the first place, right? I can remember my daughter Tanya at 6 years old telling me one day, when I have my babies, Mommy, you are going to take care of them, right? Because my mommy couldn't take care of me. So I'm going to need someone else to do that. And what a legacy for her to be able to, or for her to have to carry. I was so grateful that she was able to express that to me. But for many of our kids, they are wondering that, am I going to repeat a pattern? Am I going to be the person that my parents were? And certainly for me, I wanted my kids to know, yeah, your mom couldn't take care of you. Maybe that's so, but your mom is also a person who's so much more than that. Your mom is a person of value, and you are a person of value. And then finally, for many of our children, having that important medical information to know about certain risks that they might be at risk of, medical risks, knowing about certain pieces around traits, around trends for them, super important pieces. Now, if our kids do have contact, and they have been able to have this contact without our knowing, there are a lot of reasons why they might keep that secret from us, right? They might be afraid they were going to hurt us or disappoint us. They might be afraid of betraying either their relative caregiver or their foster parent or their adoptive parent. They could be afraid that they're going to be judged or punished for making that contact happen. They could be afraid that if we as caregivers know that they've been in contact with their birth family and their extended birth family, that we might stop that contact. We might just cut it off and say that it's not allowed. They might be worried about what the expectations are of other people, what pressures they might be getting from other people. There's also that fear, that distrust about what are the long-term possibilities? Where can this relationship go? What could I gain from it? What could I lose from it? And one of the things that we know for sure is that we don't want our children to hide that contact. I'm going to share a story with you later on about one of my children who did make contact with part of the birth family, and for reasons that still are baffling to me, thought that that needed to be kept secret, and where that ended up leading him. Then there are those questions that we have to ask ourselves as caregivers, particularly if we are fearful of or trying to stop, interrupt, or prevent those connections with the family that the kids came from. And some of the things that we need to ask ourselves are, first of all, how do I feel about my child's story, right? What are the messages that I've sent my child about those feelings, right? Depending on how they came into care, depending on what happened behind the scenes. Are we worried about them finding out information that might hurt them? Are we upset because someone else did hurt the child that we love now? And are we trying to protect them from knowing that? Do we have judgment? Do we have biases about our child's birth family? What did we hear, right, in a case file? What did we hear about what happened before we were on the scene that caused our child to be in the situation they are in now, that caused our child to come into care, to come into our family? And are those biases fair? Are they valid? Are they based on assumptions? Are they real? Have circumstances changed? Very important questions to ask ourselves. What about the curiosity that our child might have shared with us about their birth family and their history? Are they wondering who they look like? Are they wondering who they act like? I know, as I mentioned, one of our adoptions, or two of our adoptions, literally, it was siblings, right? And in the beginning of our relationship together, that adoption was closed by request of birth mom. A few years into the adoption, we were able to open the adoption. We were able to meet birth mom and develop a relationship with her. Well, my daughter Tanya looks just like birth mom. She looks just like Francine. My son Justice looks nothing like his mom. And that really caused him to have a lot of questions about who he was, and so where is my dad, and who do I look like, and where can I see that lineage so that I can compare. And for our family, we had birth children in the family as well, and both of our birth sons, my husband and I look absolutely nothing alike, but both of our birth sons, by some magic of genetics, look like both of us. And for Justice, that was really hard to see that his sister looked like birth mom, and his adopted brothers look like us, like their birth parents. And who does Justice look like? Who am I connected to? The other thing that we need to ask ourselves is, how can I provide my child, my kiddo, with the information they are seeking? So I want you to even think about, in the case of, some kind of an egregious abuse. Maybe there has been an abuse by a birth parent that has been so egregious, that has been so serious, that birth parent now has been incarcerated, whether it is a sexual abuse, an incest, or whether it is some kind of a really serious physical abuse. And now the parent that the child is curious about is in jail. They've been imprisoned. That doesn't mean that our child isn't still going to be curious. It doesn't mean that they're not still going to be wanting to know information. And so maybe what our role is going to be is to be the messenger, right? Or to be the agent between that birth parent and our child to be able to get for them the information that they need, or to be able to allow them an opportunity to try to process and understand what's happened in a deeper, in a more real way, right? And then finally, for many of us, and I can tell you that I have been here. I've had these feelings, those feelings of insecurity. So if my adopted child wants to be reconnected with birth mom or with birth dad, what is that saying about my relationship to my child? What is that saying about their relationship to me? Do I feel secure enough that I can share my child with their first parent? And talk about security and insecurity. How about if we think about that sense of security or insecurity on the part of their first parent, who's not even in a role to be the ongoing day-to-day mom or dad? And so when we think about it that way and we ponder that power shift, sometimes it can help us to feel a little bit more secure. But again, I can tell you from experience what I have seen over time, both with friends who are adoptive or foster parents and their children, comparing them to the experiences that my kids have had, as well as in my role as a youth supporter at NACAC with different programs we've had. One of the ways to more, um, I guess, one of the ways to really define for our children that they cannot count on us is to stop those connections with people that they feel very strongly that they need to remain connected to. If we put them in a position where it's an us or them, we've really put our kids in an untenable position, and no one is going to be the winner in that role. And so I'm sure that when we get back together again in a couple of weeks, many of you will have questions for me about how do you both hold safety and preserve relationship at the same time as you're supporting your child in their journey. And I'm more than happy to try to talk through some specific instances with you at that time. So here's some more questions, right, that we want to ask ourselves, because we really are, we are the instrument for our child to maintain contact, to keep open communication. We really have such a key critical role in this to either make it or break it. We can make it successful or we can make it not successful. So really asking ourselves, so my decision about whether or not my child has contact with their birth family, with their extended birth family, even with former foster caregivers or community members, what is the impact that my decision is going to have on my relationship with my child? Ultimately, we always want to be thinking about whatever we do, it is to build, to maintain, to stabilize, and to sustain our relationship with our child. Sometimes we do have to ask, is it physically or is it emotionally unsafe for my child to be in touch with their birth family? And if the answer to these two questions is that yes, it is unsafe, the next question you want to ask yourself is that really true, or is that my feeling? Is there a way I can sort of, I guess, explore my thoughts, explore my belief about it with somebody who might have some additional information, whether that's a caseworker, whether that's someone else connected to the situation, or even whether it's just a trusted friend or maybe a support group leader, maybe even your resource parent association, to bounce those questions off of one another. Because sometimes it feels as though it may be physically or emotionally unsafe. But the next question that we want to ask ourselves is, if the answer is yes, I believe it is there anything that I can do? Is there anything that we can do as a community to make it safe so that we can satisfy our child's need? We also want to think about, ask ourselves, reflect on, how is my child acting or reacting before and during and after that contact. Try to read their behavior. Try to find some times and places where you can talk with them about what that was like for them. I'm going to suggest that oftentimes the easiest and most effective place to have these kinds of conversations is while you're going for a walk together or a bike ride, or maybe in the car going for a ride. Any place where you don't have to be looking directly at one another, but can be in parallel. You can often have a deeper conversation. For our kids, all of them, all six of our kids, having those kinds of conversations with their dad always worked best out on the basketball court. They'd go out and play horse or whatever for hours on end. And in between, the play was often a time to have some pretty deep conversations. And then finally, is there a support system in place, whether that is a formal professional support system, or maybe it is going to be an informal support system through your support group or your network? But are there people in place that can help both me and my child manage those emotions? I even ask often, are there people in place to help birth mom, birth dad, extended birth family to manage their own emotions as we're trying to establish, maintain, and sustain this contact? And then these are some really important questions for us to ask our children, to explore with our children. Who do you want to contact? Oftentimes, you may be surprised. It may be that the person that they're missing the most is the cousin in the family that was their same age. Or maybe it's an auntie or an uncle that was there for them when mom or dad couldn't be. So, really exploring that and finding out who that contact, who is the person that they want to be in touch with, or the people that they want to. We want to find out from them what they're hoping for, like what when we're contacting, when we're in connection with, when we're in communication with your mom or your sibling or your grandma, your grandpa, your auntie, your uncle, what are you hoping for? What's the outcome? What worries you? Let's talk about that in advance. What worries you about that contact? How can I support you with those worries? How can I help you make sure that you're safe as this is happening? How do you want to contact your birth family? Sometimes we as caregivers jump ahead. I think a real good example of this is when our children first ask us where babies come from, right? And we're all panicky about the fact that they're asking us the big sex question when really all they want to know is, oh, it comes from your belly? Oh, that's cool. You know, I remember my 5-year-old son asked when I was pregnant with his little brother, I know daddy got that baby in your belly. How's he going to get it out again? And the simple answer was, he's going to come to the hospital with me and hold my hand and be there with me and make me feel safe. Oh, okay, that's cool. Can we go play checkers now? Sometimes it's as easy as that. So how would you like to contact your birth family? Maybe they just want to write a letter. Maybe they just want to make a picture and send it. Maybe they want a phone call. Maybe they want to visit, but we don't know that until we ask them. And then we need to ask our children. So, in terms of this next bullet point around the rules, we really want our kids to help us understand what they need in order to be safe. What rules should we put in place? How am I going to help you make sure that you feel safe and comfortable? And how am I, as your caregiver, going to address your fears around making sure that your birth family feels safe and comfortable? And as well, what do you need me to let you know so that you don't have to worry about my safety and my comfort at the same time? We want to alleviate these fears and these worries for our kids. They've got enough they're worried about already. We want to talk with them about what it feels like when they see their birth family. What's it like for you? How is that for you? I'd love to understand that. I want to join with you in your feelings. I want to support you in your feelings, right? How will you let me know when you need more or you need less, or maybe you just need a different type of contact? How will you let me know what you need? How can I assure you that I'm here for you so that I can hear what you need. And how involved do you want me to be? Certainly when our children are younger, we have to be involved. How else is the connection going to happen? But as they get older and older, we really need to know from them what feels the most comfortable in terms of that contact. How do I support you? How am I involved? How can I make this work for you? If that communication has been closed off at some point in time, or if it has never happened and you are just at the beginning of this journey, you need to know that you can really go slow. Take it one step at a time. You don't have to dive in head first. Your child doesn't have to dive in head first. We want to make sure that as we're moving forward with this communication, with this contact, that we're going at the speed that allows for us to grow together, that allows for us to get to know each other in a way that does not feel frightening, that does not feel intrusive, that does not make us feel like we have to slam the door on that connection, right? So maybe we start off, I know for example, with Justice and Tanya, we were reopening the door, right? And so it began with contacting their social worker and saying, listen, the kids really want to know who their birth mom is. And I know that when birth mom lost the children, when they came into care through a care and protection case, she was really clear that this was too painful. And so at one point in time, birth mom said, no, I don't want contact. So we went to the social worker and asked, can you help us? Can you help us open the door? Can you help us from a very neutral standpoint, right? Very, very neutral standpoint. Can you begin exploring with Francine whether or not this is something that she can do? And so it did start out very slowly. It started out with intermediaries, right? We had the support people helping. Francine also had a social worker. She is a woman who is in adult care and needs supports all the time. And so we did take it quite gradually. Once you start establishing that relationship, though, once you start establishing that safety and that sense of security and confidence and trust between one another, you can start increasing the types of contact that you have. You might do phone calls, you might do video chats. Certainly, right now, we're not going to be doing in-person visits. We are in the midst of a pandemic, and for everybody's safety and health and well-being, we have to think about those things. But we do always want to think about how we are moving forward into the future. And one of the things that we always want to keep in mind is that it's so much better for our kids to be able to establish that contact and to begin and carry on in that journey with someone by their side that they can trust, that they can rely on. And most often that's going to be us as their ongoing caregiver. Right from the beginning, we want to talk with everybody and we want to be very open about this, about what our expectations are. It may be that we all have the same expectations, but that's unlikely. I'm going to say that quite likely we all are going to have different expectations. So let's have an open conversation about that. Let's discuss it. Let's put all of our cards on the table. We need to discuss and identify who is going to initiate contact. Who is the contact going to be with? How often? How long? What will it look like? Will there be sensitive information? And how will that sensitive information be shared? We also want to think about whether or not we have to set up some privacy options. Certainly you could have a separate or a private email account or social media page. You could have a prepaid phone or a second phone number. Oftentimes people can exchange letters, pictures, all kinds of communication using a post office box. I know for us, when we first were reestablishing connection with Francine, when we would get together, it would be, at a park or at a restaurant, someplace where all of us felt like we were on neutral ground. And that can be important In our case, we weren't doing that because of safety reasons. But one of the things that I was very much aware of is there's a power dynamic, right? So I'm now the adoptive mom. Francine is the birth mom who has lost connection. I'm not going to ask her to come to my house where she's going to feel like she's on my territory. And I'm certainly not going to invade her privacy by asking to go to her home right from the beginning. As time goes on, as we get more connected, as we feel safer and more trusting with each other, then being in one another's spaces is certainly a really good way to communicate, to demonstrate that trust, to demonstrate that now you're part of our family. This is and it's not instead of, right? I'm not going to replace you, Francine. I'm going to be a mom too, but that doesn't mean that you're no longer mom. You are still and always will be. And so that's something that happens over time, and really a very mutual conversation that we share together and that we share with our children as well, right? We're going to make sure that they get to weigh into this. When safety is a concern, we have to be very honest with our children, right? We have to do it in a way that's very developmentally appropriate. And we want to think about, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, all your experienced caregivers, that just because a child is chronologically 16 or 14, that doesn't mean that emotionally they are, right? It doesn't mean that they're able to handle this as a teenager would. So we want to think about, where are they developmentally? We need to empathize with them. We need to understand and fantasize with them even about what could be, what we wish could happen. But then we also need to be really clear in the fact that our role is to keep them safe. And we need to be able to provide those kinds of boundaries that will keep them safe. Best, always optimum, if we can do that in partnership with our kids and get their input. Oftentimes, our kids know better than us even what happened once, right? They may have a hard time accepting or acknowledging with us maybe that there is a safety concern, but they probably deep down are as aware of it as we may be, maybe more so. And the other piece of this is that there are certainly people that work in the child welfare system as support folk, as post placement supports, post permanency supports, who can also help guide us through the process. And we can even sometimes ask them to come in as monitors or as visitation partners, just really thinking in a very thoughtful, very careful, very planful, and very non-judgmental way about how we're going to keep this connection and communication going. Again, I go back to always, don't say why it can't happen. Ask, how could we make it happen? What needs to be in place to make it happen? And then preparation. Oh my gosh, preparing us, preparing our children, preparing our network of people, and also to the best of our ability, or engaging other people in this process, preparing their family for the emotions that are going to come up. Understanding that a lot of times what we're hoping for is not what's going to come true, right? I think a lot in terms of, when I hear about or talk with people who have had that search and reunion further on down the road, and maybe find out that that birth mom or birth dad doesn't want connection, and how painful that can be. One of the reasons why I think it's so important that during the process of growing up, we do everything that we can to keep our children connected, to have that open communication, so that they don't find themselves at 25 or 30 trying to go back and explore only to be rejected. It can be so painful. We want to help our kids and ourselves have both conversations with one another, with partners, with other support people, about what we're hoping for, as well as what we're worried about. And try as best we can to be prepared for all of those hopes and those fears. We need to set realistic expectations for ourselves and for our children, And we need to have a plan in place, or at least have some thought that's happened ahead of time about how to handle it when we are disappointed, when our kids are disappointed. Having some background to know and to prepare our children for certain things that might become quite apparent. I know for my two kids, Justice and Tanya, they were unaware of the fact that mom had developmental disabilities. She, in of the three of them, she was quite the child. And they were really taken aback by that. I had tried to prepare them as best I could, um, but they had a real hard time with the fact that their mom was in many ways more childlike than they were. And I can remember having conversations with them after the fact about if they had been still in birth mom's family, how it was likely that they would have been parenting her rather than the other way around. Are there living environments that are going to, come as a surprise or a shock? And I'm going to really encourage you, if you don't have ongoing communication already and you are not confident in your own ability, that's okay. There's no judgment on that, but you really should think about seeking some help from a foster adoption competent therapist to help both you and your child in this journey, because it's a journey that you're going to be taking together. And it's a journey that in many ways is going to solidify your attachment to each other if it's done well. But it can be really tough to come back from a connection that has gone poorly. I also want to keep in mind and remind all of us about the fact that our children have rights in all of this. So if you think about the one event in the world that strips a child of all control, of everything that should be expected, of a birthright, that birthright is to grow up in the family that you are born to. And so the one thing that we can do to try to reestablish their control over their life, over their circumstances, is to let them have rights, to let them have a say about how this connection with their birth family is going to be. They get to decide if and when they want to have and continue contact. There's a young woman, in fact, I just was in touch with her today. So I think she's in her early 30s now. I first met her when she was 18, and she was a volunteer to be on a panel for a NACAC conference. And at that time, she had just gotten into communication with her birth family, who she had not been in communication with that she could remember ever. And what had happened in this occasion was that the birth family got in touch with the adoptive family. And between them, the birth family and the adoptive family decided to reintroduce her to her birth family and to reconnect her. And she actually came home one day to find, I believe it was birth mom and birth sister, in her living room with her adoptive family. And she talked with me about this so emotionally and so eloquently about the fact that, she said, I understand that they thought they were doing the right thing. I understand that, they had heard all of the language about how important it is to keep those connections going. But nobody asked me. Nobody asked me if I was ready for this. And I really felt blindsided. And I felt like once again, the control was taken away from me. And so I really want to urge you to always keep your children in the center of the conversation. They have the right to decide that it's time to end or to take a break from contact. And it's one of the reasons why I personally get a little bit concerned on a child's behalf about those post-adoption contracts that are often signed around open adoption. I don't know if those are a thing in Maryland or not, but I know that they are in many jurisdictions. And unfortunately, what happens when we sign contracts, our kids are not old enough. They're not adults. They don't get to sign contracts. And so sometimes they're put in a position where they have to keep doing something that they really don't want to do, right? So really checking in with them, finding out if they need a break, not to push them to do it, right? Let's not try to put an idea in their head that they might not have had, but really to find out. And then also, and this is a place where the birth family has to be on board as well, they need to understand that their child has every right to ask them questions that are related to their history and identity. And again, I think of just recently when I was training, one of the videos that we had to support the training was of an adoptive mom and her adult daughter talking about reconnecting with birth family. It was birth family that they had not been connected to for many, many, many years. And as a young adult, um, after they were connected and they had been spending some time together, one day this young woman just looked at her aunt and said, you keep telling me about how much you guys all loved me and how much you missed me, but I need to know something. Where the hell were you when I was in care all those years? If you love me so much, why weren't you there for me? And it turned out that Aunt was able to give her a very open, honest, and legitimate reason about why she wasn't there. But imagine if this young woman had not had the opportunity to ask that question and to get the answer. Our children deserve to have answers about their history, about who they are, and about where they came from. All of this gets so much more complex for a number of reasons when we're talking about these kinds of open communications and connections when we're in kinship families. That change in the status of relationship, oh my gosh, it can be so tough when your aunt suddenly is your sister and your grandma is now your mom. And when now you are suddenly the aunt or the uncle to your cousins. It can be so complicated, so complicated. There can be many power struggles and loyalty issues. Sometimes what will happen is younger kids in the family, how come grandma spends so much time with you? She doesn't spend time with me anymore now that you live with her. What does that mean? And how do we maintain our relationship as cousins if I'm jealous or resentful? Sometimes there's guilt or shame in the family around the circumstances that brought this child into care with the kinship relative. Sometimes there are very conflicting emotions around whose needs have to be met. We hear about this all the time when it's a grandmother or a grandfather caring for their grandchild, but at the same time, worrying about, caring about, and wanting to support their child, right? So, whose needs are going to come first? We know that oftentimes what will happen when kinship placement becomes a permanent placement, that the birth parent can often lose access to services because they're no longer part of that constellation that the system is paying attention to. Um, and I am honestly, I am quite deeply connected with a number of kinship families in my own network. I talk with them, I learn from them all the time, but I am certainly not the expert. But I did want to refer you to Dr. Joseph Crumley's work. He is a psychologist, he is a child welfare expert, and he's also a kinship care provider, and has done a great deal of work around supporting kinship families and their children, and has a whole series that is available at the Annie E. Casey Foundation site that goes into a number of different issues. He's got pieces in there about how to address the issues for the young people, how to address issues for the caregivers, how to address issues for the birth family themselves. And so if this is something that you are either caregiving in a kinship relationship, or if you're supporting friends or connections that are, I really urge you to go and see this series that I've cited here. Very, very helpful. And I'll tell you what, you're not going to find a better trainer than Dr. Joe. He is just amazing. And then we want to think about, what does that open communication look like for foster kids, right? So when kids are in care and they have a goal of adoption, we know from research, we know from experience that they are going to achieve better outcomes when they can also maintain the connections with their family, when they can maintain connections with other attachment figures that they've had over the years, when they don't have to wonder what happened to my brother or my sister, but they can really feel, they can feel at least some sense of comfort, some sense of ease in knowing where those family members are that they're thinking about all the time, that they're caring about all the time. We know certainly that the number one goal for kids in care, in foster care, is reunification. So the more that that connection can happen between a foster caregiver and the birth family, the deeper and more genuine that connection can be. It is going to contribute to the child being able to reunify successfully. But also, if the child does end up going on to adoption, we also know that when there has been that strong connection during the period of time when the child was in care, and things change, circumstances change, and it's determined that the child is going to move forward for adoption. What a wonderful message that that child can get when mom, when dad can say, you know what, I support this. That family who's been caring for you, I respect them. I know they love you, and I know they're going to care for you. And it's not going to mean that I'm going to stop loving you or caring for you too, but you can have both. You can have us, and you can have a permanent family. That connection can help decrease the resistance, especially for older kids that are struggling with loyalty issues. When they can get permission that they can move forward, it is really going to help them to be able to move forward. And we know that there should, and we hope that there has been, an ongoing relationship. And again, we want to demonstrate for our children that relationships do not have to cut off, that they can maintain connections, that they are important enough, that they are valuable enough, that we can, as adults, circle around them, put our own needs and our own hurts and our own worries aside to support the best outcome for them. We also know that oftentimes this can include shared parenting, and one of the resources that I'm going to be sending to Arnie to share with all of you is in a great article, again, that my pal Phyllis Stevens wrote about co-parenting and what some of those benefits can be for the birth parents, for the adoptive or foster parents, but especially for the children. And so we know that these kinds of parenting relationships are really going to help your child to grow, to learn, to have a sense of well-being, to have a sense of where they belong in the world, and also to feel safe in knowing that they can be a child, that they can sit back and know that they can trust the adults in their lives to be adults so that they can go back to being the child, right? We know that it can decrease children's defiant behaviors or troubling, challenging behaviors, because for one thing, they don't have to continually demonstrate the loyalty that they have to their birth family. They're not being asked to choose, right? They are being able to see in action that love is an action, that love is shared by both families, and that they are the center. As the child, they are the center of that love. It allows us to be able to provide all kinds of information and insights that allow the foster parent to be able to continue certain traditions, to be able to more effectively meet kids' needs in ways that they are used to, that they are comfortable with. We also know that for the birth family, it's so important to know what their child's doing, what's happening, how are they doing in school, Are there medical conditions that I need to know about? All of that important information that any parent is always going to be wondering about their child. When we can reduce conflict between the two sets of parents, that can only be good for the child, because whether or not they see it or hear it, I can tell you that they sense it, right? So we want to be there for them. And again, no, just as in a two parenting household, right? We try to make agreements and live by them to not fight in front of the children. When there's two whole sets of parents, or sometimes more than that, when they can see that we're on the same page, that reduction in conflict goes so far to support their well-being. When we can increase that birth parent support from the foster parents in reassuring them that their children are doing well, that they are being well cared for, and particularly in cases of reunification, when we can assure the birth family that the foster family is not trying to replace them, that they are standing in place of during the time when they are needed. And that knowing that we're doing it in this way, that even if the placement has to end, the relationship does not have to end, right? I have a dear friend here in Vermont where I live who has been providing foster care for two children off and on over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, while their mom is struggling with her ongoing efforts to battle and to conquer her addiction. And so mom has now been reunified with the children. They still are being monitored by the child welfare system. And the strong bond that this foster mom and this birth mom have created with one another is so strong. It's so open. It's so honest that when birth mom is struggling, she knows, and not just with addiction, but even with just stress, especially now with everything that's been happening for the last year, birth mom knows that she can reach out at foster mom. She can reach out and say, you know what, I just kind of need a break to regroup. And this foster mom will step in and do some informal respite care. She'll take the kids for a couple of hours, or she'll take them sometimes for a weekend. She doesn't have to get the system involved. Excuse me. She doesn't have to shame or blame birth mom. They have their own very natural, organic relationship that allows for them to help one another out the same way that my sister and I used to help one another out with our own kids when we were raising them when they were younger, right? Excuse me, I've got dust in my throat. So those kind of natural relationships, when they can happen, they just mean the world to our kids. And again, they speak to the ability of us as a team, as a cohesive team, to really make sure that our children know that they are going to be cared for and that they do not have to be in survival mode. Some other ideas for people to think about in terms of this, I think, as well as the Resource Parent Association as a whole, to think about what kinds of roles support staff can play in helping with an open adoption or with an open communication that's going back and forth. Understanding that adoption is not a discrete event, that this is an ongoing process, and that over the course of a lifetime, a child is going to come back and forth. A young adult is going to come back and forth to knowing and to needing to know different things about who they are and where they came from. We know that there are a variety of options that have to be looked at and considered. We know that as caregivers and as professionals and as support people, we really have to look deep inside and honestly explore what our own attitudes and assumptions and judgments are. And we also know without exception that satisfaction and positive outcomes really rely on buy-in, on a sense of wanting to be in this together from all the parties together. I do want to talk about some of the myths that people might have about what open adoption can and cannot do. What we have known from research, and this is based on research that Dr. Ruth McCroy and Hal Grodovan have done over years and has been backed up in follow-up research pieces, that first of all, open adoption doesn't interfere with the adoptive parent's entitlement, and it doesn't diminish their sense of control. In fact, what I've seen over time is that it actually enables the adoptive parent to have more of a sense of, and I don't want to really put it as control, but just a sense of really being able to parent and to parent well and to parent in partnership, right? Parents aren't confused about their rights and responsibilities, and children are not confused about who their parents are. And the other thing is, and this sometimes gets propagated by, those sensational once in a lifetime stories, but birth parents are not out there trying to take back their children. That's just not happening. We also know that birth mothers in open adoptions don't have more difficulty in resolving grief. In fact, they have a much better time of handling, understanding, and resolving grief, being able to work through the grief of loss when they do have the contact. Our children's self-esteem is definitely not negatively impacted. In fact, what can be better for a child's self-esteem than to have more people love them rather than fewer, right? We know that adolescents who are in open adoptions are not more preoccupied with adoption or with a different status. And it also does not appear to directly affect adolescents' sense of identity, certainly not in any negative way. And if anything, I would say that it increases their sense of identity and who they are, because they have the ability to know both where they came from and where they are now. We do want to talk a little bit about what some of the developmental issues are. For an infant, they're not really going to have an adoption awareness, but I will say that we know from research again that infants are very much aware of the smell, the feel, um, even the movement of birth mom. So they don't have words for it. They don't have a conscious understanding of it. But even infants who are adopted as infants and placed into the adoptive parent's arms at birth do have a sense of loss. And so good to keep that in mind, good to know that. As kids are in that age between 1 and 5, they're looking at their adoptive family, they're looking at themselves. They are aware of differences and they are ready to ask some simple questions about who they are and where they came from. And they love to hear their adoption story over and over again, right? Between the ages of 6 and 12, they're really starting to think about the meaning behind adoption. And they're starting to really grasp that idea that to be adopted means that first they were, in terrible language, but it's the way that children think about it, that they were given away. There's a sense of loss. Children will sometimes wonder, was it because I cried too much? Was it because I wasn't cute enough, right? They may grieve for their birth parents, whether or not they remember them. They may romanticize them. My daughter Justice tells me that for the years and years and years before he finally met his birth father, he had this whole fantasy about his birth father being Will Smith, which is kind of funny because Will Smith isn't really that much older than him. But Will Smith was enough older than him for him to think maybe that is my dad. And then all these other questions. Why am I adopted? What happened? Where were my birth parents? Between 13 and 15, youth are starting to really understand that implication about being adopted. They're understanding that they really do have two sets of parents, whether or not they know them both, whether or not they're able to have connection with them both. There's some ambivalence there. There's still more grief. There's still more questions. But at this point in time, they really do have the capacity, the wherewithal to be able to start doing their own search, and to really start thinking about that. And they're starting to integrate the idea that they have been adopted into their own sense of themselves. And so, again, when you think about that, the more that that adoption story can be a positive one, it's going to more lead to a positive sense of self. The more that they have unanswered questions, ambivalence, or confusion, it's more going to lead into potentially a negative sense of self. And then as they're getting on to the years when they would possibly, be able to have children themselves, that yearning for connection can really start cropping up. They're starting to understand that the loss of their birth parent is also a loss of part of themselves. They may try on different traits of birth parents, whether they're actually known or they're just fantasized. They're going to have lots of curiosity. Many will be searching for birth parents. And so we have to be aware of these things, certainly as they're getting to an age where they might be having children of their own. It's going to stir up all of these questions and these emotions and these thoughts again. We do know that there's not one way that fits everybody. Every single family has their own needs, has their own style. What we do know, though, is that the more that everyone is on the same page around what the connection, the communication, and the openness looks like, the more there is a sense of satisfaction. These are my kiddos. So this guy right here holding this beautiful baby is our son Jim, who, as I said to you, came to us at 15, was adopted at 16. Justice and Tanya are siblings. And this is Tanya again with her birth cousin. And this is Melvin. And each one of our children had a very different experience around their openness and connection. And I share these things, and a couple of things I want to let you know. My children know that I share some of their stories. They have given me permission for that. They have also told me very explicitly what I can share and what I cannot share. And I am completely committed to honoring their wishes around that. So when we have further discussions in a couple of weeks, you may ask me questions that I won't answer on their behalf because I have made those commitments. But most of the questions you might ask me, I'll be happy to answer. So Jim came to us, at 15, already knowing his whole birth family. There were no secrets about who anybody was. He had connections with many members of his birth family when we first were joined as family. And those connections continued for some years, until at some point in time, Jim made his own determination that he did not any longer want the connection, and asked us to honor his wishes. And I have to tell you that both the mom in me and the professional in me is hoping that one day he will change his mind about that. But as his mom, I respect his wishes. And so he, at this point in time, does not have any connection to his birth family. As I told you, Justice and Tanya, they actually both were in care from the time Justice came into care at 3 months old. Tanya came into care at birth. And they spent their years from infancy until they were 6 and 7, respectively, until they came into our family. They were in multiple homes and had no connection to birth mom. We were able to open up their adoption when they were 9 and 10. And they continue to have connection with their birth family to this day. One of the incredible outcomes of that was that they were able to meet their birth mom's brother, Curtis, Uncle Curtis, who is a dad. This is his daughter. And my two kids were able to see that their birth family, the family they came from, actually had the capacity to parent and to parent well. And it was a really important image and message for them to get, not just in words, but in action. Because until that point in time, I think I had mentioned earlier, I was training all day today too, and I know I mentioned it during my training. But until they were able to meet Uncle Curtis and to meet his children, Tanya specifically used to talk to me about the fact that when she had children, I would be the parent to those children because she didn't understand. She did not embrace the idea that her family line could care for their children. And so, what an important and wonderful message for her to get. The other thing that happened, though, and here's where I'm going to bring back that idea of the secrecy, why children might hide that they've reconnected, and how very dangerous it is. Justice, right here, Justice, always had gotten messages from us that he was welcome and encouraged to make connections with birth family. We didn't know anything really about his birth dad. But what little we did know led us to believe that it was potentially a harmful connection. Unfortunately, what happened for Justice was that he did connect with his birth father, and then he was instructed by multiple people to keep that connection secret. In his effort to keep the connection secret, we actually lost Justice for about 3 years. From the age of 19 until 22, he completely dived into birth dad's world. It was a very unsafe world, and he completely cut off connections from his dad and myself and from his siblings because in his own fantasy, he believed that he couldn't have both. When he came back to the family 3 years later, we welcomed him with open arms. And to this day, he talks about how much he wishes that he had not made the assumptions that he had made. I'm going to encourage you. It doesn't always turn out that well, right? It's not always a happy ending. We couldn't be happier than the fact that he was able to find his way back home. He still does have connections with many of his paternal relatives. He does not any longer have connection with his dad, and that is his choice. And Melvin, I met Melvin's birth mom in court, actually, when she was hoping and working to try to overturn the termination of parental rights. And she was unsuccessful in that. And as I have become more experienced in child welfare, this was so many years ago that this happened. I was not working in the field at that point in time, and didn't know a whole lot. I only knew what I was told. The sad part is I do believe that she could have parented him, and I believe that the system never gave her a chance. One of my fondest and hardest memories is embracing her and making promises to one another that we would both always love him. And she has, in later years, I was able to reconnect with her. She was an incredible support for both Melvin and for myself as he was struggling with addiction. And Melvin ultimately died as a result of his addiction. And his mom was one of the most incredible supporters for us, and spoke at his funeral, and shared with people that his legacy was not a reflection of him, or at least not a negative reflection of him. It was the most powerful thing I think I've ever seen. So each one of our kids had very, very different experiences with their connections to their birth families. And for each one of them, it was absolutely critical to our ongoing relationship with them, that our family was able to honor what they wanted, was able to follow their lead in what those connections look like. I also have several different resources here that I want to share with you. I'm going to send this to you. You have the handout, but I'm also going to send an additional page, as I said, to Arnie, so that you will have the actual page with these resources as well as others. And it will be as simple as just a click on the link to open them up. So you won't have to cut and paste and retype and all the rest of that. Lots of great resources out there to really help you in your journey as you're moving forward. And finally, I wanted you to have my contact information. I'm kind of surprised that I was able to, I managed to fill up an entire hour and a half. So I'm super happy to know that we're going to be coming back in a couple of weeks to be able to share some time talking, because I really, really want to be able to hear from you all. I want to know what you have on your minds. I want to talk with you and help you on your own journeys with your own children in trying to make sure that you are both following and leading and supporting them on their journeys with staying connected to all the families in their lives that have meant something to them.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I know we burned through a lot of time there, and it was very interesting to hear your comprehensive view, your personal experiences, and your significant other contacts. Without a doubt, you certainly have experienced quite a few, if not all, of the emotions that each of us as resource parents feel. And then as we circle back and come back in 2 weeks, first of all, if you have questions, please enter them in the chat now, or you can email them to us, and I'll make sure we send you a link tomorrow to send questions. But as we come back in 2 weeks, there's a couple things that I want us to be thinking about. And moving from a more comprehensive view where we were given a lot of information about a lot of different scenarios tonight, maybe we'll also narrow our focus a little bit in light of the federal government, state and local DSS's efforts, or the local agencies' efforts, and focus on supporting relationships with birth families from the very start and from the moment they come into foster care. It really highlights and heightens the need for ongoing and open communication. And that was one of the things that I think stuck out frequently throughout your presentation. And I just referenced the slides. On slide number 6, you talked about our judgmental views. And that's something that we have to work on as a resource parent from day one to be successful in transitioning these children back home or into permanency in our lives. One of the biggest barriers is our own judgmental views. And then on slide number 10, we talked about, is it true or is it just how I feel? And those are tough questions we have to ask ourselves because sometimes it's one or the other, and generally never both. But how do we tear that apart? So those are some of the questions I'll be asking you as we move into our discussion 2 weeks from tonight. We don't want kids, and I know that that's all of our desires. We don't want kids to be ending up at 25 with no place to go because they had unmet expectation or fantasies or dreams that were unrealistic. And that's on slide number 15. And, you know, we also need to think then as we move on into the next couple slides, 16, 17, and 18, about what do the children need, or having them help control the process. And maybe control is a word that we don't like to necessarily deal with as a parent or as a resource parent. But the reality is we need not only to partner with the birth families with older teens, we have to partner with them to help them understand that we are there with them. always remembering that the child needs to be in the center. So I thank you all for joining us tonight. We will be back with questions. Please, as you exit, pop your name in the chat so we know you were here to the end so we can get you your certificate. Thank you, Kim, for joining us and being candid and open about your own personal journey, the highs, the lows, some of the things that worked out better than you had hoped for, and some of the things that gave you more depth and understanding than you could have ever dreamed. So those are the things that I enjoyed tonight, and we will be back and address some of those things in a more singular or narrowed focus. But I think we will start our conversation around how do we as parents, as humans, work through the judgmental views that so often we encounter in our journey through child welfare. So thank you all. Thank you, Kim. Do you have a final word? And we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Just very nice to be with you all. I appreciate your time and keep up the good work. Your kids need you.
So thank you all. Thank you all. And please come back in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.
Good night.